Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to what is quickly spiraling into a bear attack area in need of intervention. Western Montana has been featured on this channel time and time again, so this time is no surprise. Near the town of Big Sky is a trail system known as the Yellow Mule Trails. The mountains around the town tower to over 10,000 feet, with Gallatin Peak being the tallest. The steep granite mountains are crowded with expansive stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees, and contain pockets of aspen interspersed here and there. Along nearly every body of water, you may find bulrush and willow cushioned by lush grasses between. It is a sportsman's paradise here, but recently it became a sportsman's nightmare. At about 1:45 p.m. on September 8, 2023, 61-year-old Rudy Norlander was up doing what he loved, hunting and being in the outdoors. Rudy is the owner of Alpine Adventures, an ATV rental company in Big Sky. He is a U.S. Navy veteran. Anyone who knew Rudy understood he was always prepared. He was a fan of the hit TV show Survivor and even tried to audition. On this day, he had his bear spray and his high-powered hunting rifle along with him. Rudy loved going to the Yellow Mule's Loop Trail, which is a circuitous route winding through prime deer habitat, but it also leads through prime grizzly territory. Rudy had a client rent some ATVs for their deer hunt, and Rudy had tagged along to hang out. The father and son had walked off a short distance, spotted a deer, and eventually worked their way within shooting distance. After firing a shot at what they thought was a lethal spot on the deer's anatomy, they went down to the location where the deer was standing when they shot. Now, conventional wisdom says that when you track a wounded game animal, you mark your position from where you shot, then proceed to the location where the game animal was wounded. From there, you look for telltale information provided in the surroundings. When a deer is struck with a bullet or an arrow, blood isn't necessarily visible right away, but you can usually see a disturbed pattern in the game animal tracks. The tracks may veer sideways or it may stumble. That may be the location where the game animal was struck by the projectile. After locating the tracks of the wounded animal, blood or tissue evidence should start appearing along the tracks if you hit the game animal in a vital area. Sure enough, the father and son found a decent blood trail indicating their shot was true. It seemed to peter out after following the blood trail for some time. They lost the track and decided to go back up to the ATVs and tell Rudy about what had happened. As soon as they reached the ATV, they told Rudy about how the blood trail had just disappeared and asked him for advice. Rudy wasn't the kind of guy to let a wounded game animal go without doing his best to locate the carcass. Together, the three of them headed back down the trail in search of the blood trail. Rudy knew this area like the back of his hand. He took a familiar trail that led him to the area the other men described and found a blood trail. It turned out that it was a different deer than the one wounded by the hunters, and there were already some very dangerous hunters following this one. In the fall, bears of all sorts are in hyperphagia, which simply means they eat as much food wherever they can find it. They are trying to pack on fat for hibernation and can roam hundreds of miles over a week's time in search of it. They will do desperate things if they have not gained the requisite fat, and have been known to be most active and aggressive during this time of year. A few hundred yards away, Rudy saw an adult grizzly. He decided he would pull his rifle out, just in case he needed to defend his and his fellow hunters' lives. Rudy holed himself up behind a tree and could see a juvenile grizzly a little way away from him. By the time he redirected his attention back to the large grizzly bear, his entire situation had turned extremely dangerous. The giant grizzly, described as being a 10-foot mega grizzly, had closed in on Rudy. He was by himself, having separated from the father and son who were looking elsewhere for the wounded deer. The giant grizzly had suddenly reappeared danger close to Rudy. It isn't clear what brought the bear within such close proximity to the man so quickly. Perhaps his scent had drifted to it on a fickle breeze, but whatever the case, it was now closing in on him with its eyes fixed directly on him. Rudy raised his rifle to his shoulder and yelled, trying to get the bear to stop its charge. As it closed in on him, he knew he had only one option, and he took aim and squeezed the trigger of his hunting rifle. Expecting a loud report and a sturdy kick as the rifle discharged, Rudy was terrified when he only heard the click of the firing pin striking the primer. His hunting rifle had misfired, and at the most crucial time of his life. In the adrenaline-filled moments of a bear attack, victims' brains reportedly process thoughts and information very quickly. Rudy's first thought was to fall down and play dead, but he knew he wouldn't even be able to dive to the ground before the bear would be on him. In a last-ditch attempt at driving the bear off, Rudy swung his fist with all his might and struck the bear in the nose. Rudy's punch bounced off of the grizzly's nose as if it didn't connect. The bear reached out its jaws and clamped them onto Rudy's face like some kind of predatory kiss of death. The single bite from the grizzly's jaws shattered Rudy's lower jaw, and with one shake of its head, his entire lower jaw was torn from his face. Along with Rudy's jaw came a portion of his trachea, which is the cartilage tube we use to breathe. The enraged grizzly began clawing at Rudy's chest cavity, slicing through bones, skin, and flesh with very little resistance. With Rudy's chest torn wide open, the grizzly moved its attack down to his right leg. It bit his leg several times, opening up huge puncture wounds from which his blood poured onto the ground around him. During the attack, Rudy's body was being tossed around like a pillow at a teenager's slumber party. The grizzly then clamped its jaws onto his left bicep and drove its 2-inch-long canines clean through his skin and muscle, opening up several more huge puncture wounds. Now, in prior episodes, we have discussed what really happens when any bear bites a human being. They don't simply clamp down until their teeth come together. They drive their canines through the flesh and use their body mass and strength to pull the flesh away. This nearly always creates a wound cavity beneath the skin that can fill with infection and at least bruise the tissue. If this were a horror movie, you would expect to see the victim lose consciousness, but Rudy stayed conscious through the entire attack. He wasn't a limp body being tossed around during the attack, but chose to fight for his life, yelling, kicking, and punching the grizzly the entire time. A short way around the mountain, the father and son had heard Rudy's screams and the bear's roars. They arrived at the attack scene while the bear was still mauling Rudy, but hesitated to fire their rifle as they didn't want to hit him. They did manage to shoot the bear one time before they grabbed rocks and began pelting the bear as they yelled, trying to run it off. For some reason, the rocks worked. The bear turned around and disappeared into the forest, for now. As they approached Rudy's side, they could see he was near death's door. They fortunately discovered they had cell service. They retrieved their cell phone and reached out to emergency responders for immediate medical attention for Rudy. While waiting for the paramedics to respond, the father and son continually asked Rudy if he was okay. He was missing so much of his face. All he could do was lift his hand and give them an affirmative thumbs up in response. Given the amount of pain and trauma Rudy had just experienced, it seems a medical miracle that he didn't pass out or at least go into shock. The hunters waited with him until they heard the unmistakable sound of the Gallatin County Life Flight helicopter entering the valley. Along with the Life Flight paramedics, the GCSS Air, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Law Enforcement, U.S. Forest Service Law Enforcement as well, and the Gallatin County Sheriff's deputies all responded to Rudy's attack scene. Rudy's route to medical help was met with some confusion. During the attack, he had sustained a complete removal of his lower jaw, partial removal of his trachea, a collapsed lung from the bear tearing open his chest, and numerous other gashes and puncture wounds from the grizzly's claws and teeth. They knew he needed urgent life-saving medical care, but his wounds had to have approached the support limitations of every hospital in the vicinity. At the Bozeman Health Deaconess Regional Medical Center, Rudy underwent surgery to stabilize his condition. Medical professionals there performed a tracheostomy, which is an incision into the trachea to allow air to enter the trachea from an unobstructed pathway. From there, Rudy was flown to the University of Utah Hospital in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he is currently recuperating in the intensive care unit at the time of this video creation. The most recent updates on Rudy's condition indicate that he is off the ventilator now and is doing better. He recently underwent the first of many reconstructive surgeries to repair at least part of the damage done to his face. He reportedly even walked around a bit at the hospital. His daughter indicated that plans to remove one of his fibulas from his lower leg to recreate his lower jaw eventually. For now, he will have a metal plate inserted to replace his jaw for the short term. From the time he was attacked to when he arrived at the hospital in Bozeman, Rudy had been horribly mangled but managed to stay alert and aware for 2 hours. In response to Rudy's attack, authorities have closed the area around Yellow Mule Trail system to any foot traffic and have initiated a search for the giant grizzly bear. A GoFundMe account has been opened up if you would like to help Rudy offset some of his medical bills, and it is linked to in a pinned comment below this video. A few of Rudy's photos have been posted on my Patreon linked below, so if you want to check them out, they are available. If this were the end of this episode, it would be plenty, but I have some more information on a follow-up regarding the episode about Amy Adams's fatal grizzly attack on July 22nd, just about 50 miles south of Rudy's. Just west of West Yellowstone, a sow and cub grizzly had been breaking into cabins and homes in search of food. She had entered through windows and devoured dog food and any other food items she could find. The sow had a single cub that would accompany her during her home invasions. The sow and cub were apprehended after complaints were filed by the residents in the area. DNA evidence was pulled from both grizzlies and compared to the DNA evidence pulled from the scene of Amy's attack. The samples were compared favorably. The same sow was also found to have attacked a man in Idaho 3 years ago near Henry's Lake. Both grizzlies were positively identified as the bears who killed Amy Adamson and were immediately euthanized. In the last month, at least 4 close encounters have been reported to authorities by outdoorsmen. All of the encounters in which the bears were killed were deemed self-defense and the victims were not cited for any violations. Dan Springer, Gallatin County Sheriff's deputy, encourages people who decide to venture into the forests to plan for contingencies. A cell phone that worked and received a signal was integral to saving Rudy's life in this episode, and many other instances of similar occurrences have also been documented. First aid and trauma kits are essential as well. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks issued a statement declaring that Montana is bear country. They state that grizzly populations are increasing in density and are becoming more widespread. The likelihood of people encountering grizzlies will increase in occurrence and frequency. Wow, what an episode. After reviewing the facts surrounding this attack, I am left with a few questions for you. What would you do if you found yourself between 2 different grizzly bears while tracking a wounded deer? Do you plan to put a cell phone into your backpack next time you venture into the forest? What other defensive tools do you recommend for a person to use to defend themselves in addition to bear spray and a high-powered rifle? What factors can you identify that led to Rudy's survival? I will be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us back to familiar territory, the eastern slope of the Canadian Rocky Mountains in south-central Alberta, Canada. The area around Wyperus is perhaps the world's current hotbed for grizzly bear attacks. The rolling hills of the Canadian Rocky Mountain foothills invite outdoor enthusiasts of varied interests. Hunters, hikers, campers, loggers, fishermen, and other adventurers are seeking the beauty, resources, and freedom more now than ever before. The forests here are packed with pine, fir, spruce, and aspen trees interrupted by stands of willows and berry bushes along the water sources in the area. Common animals in this area include deer, elk, and moose, and you might even see sheep and goats on the higher peaks to the west. The dominant predators in the area include coyotes, wolves, cougars, black bears, and grizzly bears. It seems that the grizzly bears here are the predatory species that are increasing in their confrontations with human beings. In many of the locations we discuss on this channel, a shortage of food is often a contributing factor to bear attacks, but in this episode, it is actually an abundance of food that does so. On the afternoon of July 19, 2016, 25-year-old Laura Hayworth and her husband James were enjoying sunbathing at Trapper's Campground positioned along the Ghost River. I know what you are thinking. Why do so many of these attacks happen in places with creepy or strange names? In some of the locations of the bear attacks we discuss, the appearance of a mountain shaped like a bear tooth, or named after something with a malevolent sound could be a coincidence, but maybe not. James and Laura had put some thought into their camping trip, at least enough to bring bear spray along with them. They had even practiced dispensing it just in case they may need to. As James and Laura basked in the sunshine just above an embankment along the river, she noticed a rustling in the bushes just a few meters behind them. Laura glanced over and saw something grayish, brown in color moving among the bushes and assumed it was wolves. She stood to her feet and told James to get up.
She informed him that she thinks she sees a couple of wolves. James stood to his feet just in time to get a brief glimpse of 2 grizzly bear cubs. As soon as he did so, his vision was filled with the shape of the biggest grizzly bear he had ever seen, emerging quickly from the bushes only 8 feet from him and his wife. As the bear thundered toward the couple, she let out a roar that shook their bones. She growled and roared as she came at them in fear they were a threat to her cubs. The bear closed in on them so quickly that James had no time to react. Both James and Laura fumbled with the safety cap on their bear spray, but it appeared to be jammed. The bear had bore down on them so quickly that they had no time to properly dispense the spray. At a distance of only a few feet, even if they had managed to operate the bear spray correctly, it would not have been able to disseminate the cloud of irritant in an effective manner. The only thing they could have hoped for was a direct shot in her eyes and nose, but they were not able to complete that. Terror filled James as the attack scene from the movie The Revenant flashed through his mind. He thought he was dead, no doubt about it. He knew there was no way he could avoid her. She bowled him over and took him to the ground. Her immense size and weight forced the reality of the futility of resistance into James's mind. James scrambled back to his feet and started yelling at the bear. She returned to him and knocked him down once again. The sow was running back and forth between him and Laura, briefly confused about who posed a greater danger. James' brain was thinking very quickly, trying to process how to handle and escape from the danger posed by the enraged sow. He quickly told Laura to jump into the river, and he began running toward its banks himself. Just as James reached the river shore, he felt the enormous impact of the sow tackling him from behind. The sow had slammed him down onto the edge of the river and was standing over him with her front paws on the back of his thighs. The only thought racing through James's mind was that he was a dead man. This sow had knocked him down and sent him flying through the air, crashing onto the rocks 3 times now in a matter of a few seconds. She was now holding him under water, which would cause him to drown in a matter of a minute or so. This was clearly not a sow looking only to make sure her cubs were safe, but one that wanted to exterminate any threat to them. Whenever bears attack a prey animal in the water, they are frequently witnessed pulling it into deeper water by the neck or back. Then they climb onto it and force its nose or head underwater, utilizing the water to drown their prey. James was now feeling the same urgency as so many moose, deer, or elk may have experienced from a bear attack in water. Suddenly he felt the sow's weight shift and get off of his thighs. He emerged from the water to see the sow now chasing after Laura. Laura was smaller than James, and the bear knocked her down with just as much force. Laura lifted her hands to her face as she screamed in terror, hoping to ward off the bear's jaws from crushing her skull. James again scrambled back to his feet and sprinted toward the bear and his wife. He watched as the bear stood over Laura's outstretched hands as the bear clamped down on Laura's wrist. It began to dash toward the bushes with Laura bouncing along the ground, in tow. As James gained ground on the bear, dragging his wife, the bear glanced over and saw him. It immediately let go of Laura's wrist and disappeared into the bushes to find her cubs. At this point, James wasn't sure what damage had been done during the lightning-fast bear attack to himself, nor his wife. He ran over to Laura's side and dragged her away from the edge of the bushes. He had hoped the bear would realize the distance between them was safe enough to gather her cubs and flee the area. As James looked up the slope, searching for the bears, he could see the sow and cubs scampering up the hillside. The couple discussed how they could get out of the area without causing another altercation with the sow and cubs. They began making their way along the river shore to a clearer location with bushes. They made noise and yelled as they went, so the sow would know where they were. A little way down the valley, a ranch hand at the Lazy H Ranch, Coleman Blair was helping bring in some hay. He heard the commotion from the attack and looked upstream to see James emerging from the river and Laura underneath the bear as it chewed on her. He usually carried his rifle whenever he went to work, but for some reason he left it at home on this day. By the time he arrived at James and Laura's location, the bear had made its way across the river and was emerging on the opposite bank. In a matter of minutes, James and Laura heard a man's voice yelling in reply to their cries for help. Up at the top of the cliff, they could see 2 men, one with a red shirt and the other with a dark shirt. James and Laura yelled, "Help! Help!" and told them there was a bear nearby. The 2 men indicated they knew of the bear and could see that it had departed the immediate area. James and Laura could see one of the men scrambling down the cliff toward them as the other stood watch from above to keep an eye on the sow's location. Blair ran down a large embankment towards the scene. The bear had moved away to the other side of the river by the time he reached James and his wife. He could see Laura's wrist was clearly broken due to its misshapen appearance. She had several deep bite wounds, scrapes, and cuts from being dragged across the rocky ground. James didn't have any bite wounds but was scraped and bruised from the encounter. He also had an indelible bear paw-shaped bruise on his hamstring from where the sow stood on top of him at the riverbank. Blair stated later that when you see someone getting chewed on by a grizzly, you really can't just stand around. Due to his response, a follow-up attack by the sow may have been avoided. As soon as Blair had reached the couple's location, the three of them began making their way back up the steep embankment. He stated later that Laura was very shaken up by the experience and was chewed up pretty badly. As soon as they had reached the top, James dashed off to fetch the vehicle and rush his wife to get medical attention. He jumped into the vehicle and peeled out toward his wife, sending dirt flying as he went. Blair helped load Laura into the vehicle, and she and James quickly disappeared back down the road in a cloud of dust. A short distance down the dirt road, an ambulance pulled into view. The couple skidded to a stop, and the paramedics went to work on Laura. They began to assess her injuries and bandage them according to severity. They also radioed in for a medical helicopter team to respond for urgent care for Laura. The helicopter arrived at their location a short while later. The entire time the paramedics worked on Laura, she pled for them to tend to her husband, worried that he was also injured by the angry sow. They loaded Laura into the helicopter and flew her to the nearest hospital while James drove himself there in their vehicle. Later, James stated that people need to understand that animals must be respected. He continued to acknowledge that if the sow had wanted to tear them limb from limb, she would have done so. He accepted her behavior as her way of saying, "These are my cubs, get away," and is grateful that the outcome wasn't worse. An inspector with the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Branch indicated that bear attacks in the Waiparous area aren't that rare anymore. He stated that they have seen a half-dozen bear attacks within the last few years. The attacks have ranged from bluff charges to painful bites to serious maulings. Authorities took clothing from James and Laura to try to pull DNA from the sow's slobber that may have been present on the clothes. They plan to analyze it in an attempt to link the sow with any future problems they may have with her. When it comes to a sow defending her cubs, authorities are always cautious in reacting with lethal force. They stated that grizzlies play an integral part of the ecosystem, and removing one has ripple effects on many other animals and plants in the area. They also plan to close the area for a lengthy amount of time to allow the sow and her cubs to make their way through it. Biologists indicated that this year's wild berry yield in the Waiparous area was a bumper crop compared to adjacent ecosystems. The plentiful food source brought grizzlies from miles around to the location to feast on the sugary, nutritious delicacies to help them gain weight needed for hibernation. This food source is particularly important to sows and cubs, given there is no annual reliable salmon runs around there. After reviewing the details of this episode, I am left with a few questions for you. Do you think the attack was a territorial attack or a defensive one? Could this attack have been avoided if James and Laura hadn't stood to investigate the rustling in the bushes near them? Would a firearm have changed the outcome of this attack, or did it happen far too fast? Would you expect to be attacked by a protective sow when you are sunbathing on a river embankment? As an added challenge, let's see who can list the most contributing factors that led to Laura's survival. I will be glad.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to the small town of Grand Isle, about 325 kilometers northwest of Prince George. It is in central British Columbia, Canada, along Babine Lake, and is one of the best locations in the world to view grizzly bears during the sockeye salmon runs from August to October each year. The Fulton River Project near Grand Isle is a man-made salmon spawning bed, with the first channel being constructed in 1965 and the second in 1971. These channels are about 5 miles long and allow sockeye fry to take advantage of the ideal rearing potential in upstream Babine Lake. Annually, these channels have the capacity to produce 135,000 adult salmon, as well as provide jobs to area residents. About 2,000 people visit the channels each year to watch the grizzly bears fight for prime salmon fishing locations and gather the calories they need for survival. When the grizzlies show up here, they take part in a massive cycle of nutrients that originates here and extends into the Pacific Ocean, where the majority of the salmon life cycle occurs. The fry and smolt spend the first 3 years of their life in the confines of fresh water before making their way downstream to the ocean. While feeding in the ocean, sockeye salmon can grow up to about 2.5 feet in length and up to around 15 pounds. After 2 years in the ocean, they are approaching the end of their life cycle, which culminates in them making their way up the exact same watersheds from which they came, and frequently returning to the same gravel beds from which they hatched to breed the next generation. Bears, wolves, and other animals help circulate the nutrients to the areas surrounding the streams by carrying the salmon carcasses into the brush, thereby fertilizing the plants there. Any disruption in this 5-year cycle in the important source of protein, fat, and nutrients that bears need can disrupt or stress grizzly populations. As far as nutrients that grizzlies get from salmon, here is a quick breakdown. They typically prefer the brain and roe, which are the eggs, as well as the skin of salmon. Each tablespoon of roe offers bears or any consumer about 2 grams of protein and 1 gram of carbohydrates. Each female salmon produces between 600 to 800 eggs per pound of body weight. That means a single female salmon, called a hen, weighing 10 pounds can produce between 6,000 to 8,000 eggs for her reproductive life cycle. The skin and brain of the salmon offer important sources of fats and vitamins as well, but the roe is the bear's big payoff when it comes to salmon. The geography around Grand Isle is mountainous, with valleys lined by dense stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees, with a thick forest floor of alder, willows, and berry bushes. Mule deer, elk, bison, and moose are common forest dwellers you may see in this area. Predators here include coyotes, mountain lions, wolves, black bears, and grizzly bears. Each of these predators balances on an ecological food system which overlaps in part with each other. At around 7 a.m. on September 29, 2021, a 70-year-old photographer, whom we will call Jack, was vying for position to take pictures of the grizzlies as they fished for salmon. Getting a good photograph of a grizzly while it is fishing is an amazing and captivating pursuit that can lead to an image representing 2 successful recovery stories. Both salmon and grizzlies have been protected and growing since preservation efforts started around the middle of the last century. As Jack walked down an access road that went along the Fulton River project, he searched for a perch to observe the bears. This project diverts water from the adjacent Fulton River and directs it along a winding series of engineered gravel breeding areas called redds. All along the river, grizzlies gather to compete to catch the salmon as they migrate toward the redds to finish their life cycle. Grizzlies do not normally tolerate close proximity with each other or humans, but due to the abundance of food here, they can be found in high numbers. They are so focused on finding and defending their location to catch fish that photographers and onlookers will frequently find themselves within a few yards of bears without much threat. This creates an illusory atmosphere in many human visitors' minds. They sometimes slip into a relaxed mindset, believing the bears to disregard human presence.
The dense undergrowth along the Fulton River provides very good cover for any animal there. The grizzlies navigate the area on a bear-established trail system which weaves its way along the banks and periodically emerges onto human trails and roads.
As Jack walked along the access road with his camera and gear in hand, he approached one of these junctions at a very inopportune time.
Unbeknownst to Jack, a grizzly was just leaving the riverside along a trail and converging on his travel route. Surprising a bear, even one with a belly full of salmon roe, is never a good idea. As soon as the bear saw the man within just a few yards of itself, its fight or flight reaction took over, and the fight reaction of a bear is always dangerous to a human. If you surprise me, you might just get punched in the nose, but a bear doesn't have fists, so you can imagine the equivalent reaction. The bear blitzed the man in a blur of brownish fur and roaring teeth. Jack held out his arm as a means to maintain separation between his body and the angry bear. In an attack that lasted only a few seconds, the grizzly clamped its jaws onto Jack's arm and tossed its head back and forth, tearing holes the size of quarters into his forearm and upper arm. The attack consisted of several bites in rapid succession before the bear dashed off into the bush.
I may be dating myself by saying this, but some grizzlies are slightly smaller than a Volkswagen Bug from the 1960s, and you may be dating yourself by understanding my meaning. Most people think an animal the size of a small vehicle would be easy to spot and avoid, but even a large bear can move with amazing speed. Before Jack could process the events that transpired, the bear was gone, and he was lying on his back along the access road. It wasn't but a few minutes before other photographers and visitors in the area arrived at Jack's side after hearing him yelling during the attack. They could see the enormous holes in his arm gashed by the bear's teeth and comforted him while calling for medical assistance. Jack was loaded up and flown to a hospital in Prince George, a little more than 150 miles away. Once there, his condition was stabilized and his wounds were sutured closed. His injuries were not life-threatening, but were imparted in such a rapid manner that a prolonged attack may have threatened his life or may have cost him his arm. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police in the nearby town of Houston were sent out to respond to Jack's grizzly attack. They worked in conjunction with the Conservation Officer Service in the investigation. Given that the bear and Jack met along a brush-covered roadside, the investigators deemed the attack as a strictly defensive attack and decided that no further action would be taken against the grizzly. It was decided the bear was not acting as a nuisance to humans and would not be killed or relocated. The Conservation Officer Services issued warnings to visitors about surprising bears and encouraged the public to take precautions against it. Packing bear spray and making a lot of noise may prevent confrontations and attack when traveling through bear country. They encourage people to stay aware of their surroundings and travel in groups as much as possible. Conservation officers here have received an average of 138 calls each month in BC in the month of September each year. Only 32 of those calls required a response by an officer. Over this time frame, only 3 grizzlies have had to be killed due to danger or nuisance to humans. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think it is wise to reintroduce grizzlies into their former habitat in areas without re-establishing salmon runs which helps them survive? How do you think Jack may have avoided this attack? Do you think bear spray would have prevented this attack? Would you feel safe walking along an access road near a river lined with giant, hungry grizzly bears?
Do you run away or punch at people when they jump scare you?
I will be happy to read and reply to your thoughts, so post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode whisks us away to the Cabinet Mountains, which cross the Idaho and Montana borders. The elevation of this mountain range varies between 2,000 feet along the Kootenai River in Idaho and 8,740 feet on the range's highest point, Snowshoe Peak. The Cabinet Yaak Mountain ecosystem covers about 2,600 square miles and has been labeled as a grizzly bear recovery zone, according to the Vital Ground Foundation website. In this mountain system, forests of hemlock, pine, fir, and spruce trees, with birch trees, grow along bodies of water. The primitive forests here are nearly pristine and have been well preserved, making it a great place to learn about the 50 grizzly bears that roam the mountain range. Deer, elk, and moose are common prey for the predators here, which include cougars, wolves, coyotes, and black bears, as well as grizzly bears. Along the drainage of Portman Creek, just south of Libby, 28-year-old Amber Cornack was tasked with checking the grizzly hair collection stations. These stations are built out of barbed wire, which snags the hair as bears rub against it. This allows for the compilation of a DNA database of bears in the area and is critical to studying the bears. Wayne Cassworm worked as a biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and had hired Amber for temporary seasonal employment. Amber had graduated from Oregon State University in 2016 with a bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife management. The study of animals was her passion, and she'd hopped from job to job, seeking to fulfill her passion and turn it into a permanent career. Amber's assignment required that she spend hours hiking remote trails all alone. She'd completed specialized training on how to be safe and how to handle animal attacks while in the field. She'd even completed training in similar disciplines as a 16-year-old hunter years before. Amber grew up in Michigan, but had globetrotted with employment assignments in wildlife agencies in Oregon, Missouri, Florida, and Idaho. She made Montana her permanent home, no matter where her assignments took her. On May 17, 2018, Amber had been in the field for 3 days. At around 11 a.m., she just pulled a bundle of hair from one of the barbed wire snags set up for that purpose. She had 3 or 4 more snags to retrieve samples from and was hiking near Portman Creek, which was surging with loud spring runoff. Typically, Amber would use a whistle to alert bears or other animals to her presence in their territory, or she would stomp her feet as she hiked and clap her hands loudly as she walked between snags. She was well trained in safety measures and practiced them with discipline. Amber wasn't carrying a firearm, but she was carrying her bear spray as she completed her hair collection duties. At one point in her hike, Amber heard a loud and very close woof to her left. She quickly glanced in the direction of the noise and could see a huge grizzly bear, only 12 feet from her. She knew this was a critical point in the confrontation, as she had clearly surprised the bear as much as it had surprised her. She knew the grizzly would either attack her or bolt in the opposite direction, and hoped for the latter. Amber knew that given the proximity of the run-in, her best option was to play dead. She turned to her right and dropped to the ground in the nearest bush, hoping that her backpack might absorb any attack from the grizzly. By the time she did this, she could already feel the grizzly pressing into her back. She could feel a powerful slap from the grizzly bear on her back and its claws tearing into her arm. She reached down to her bear spray, which she had holstered on her hip, and flipped the safety guard off. That is when she felt the bear's teeth clamp onto the back of her skull. The back of her head was the easiest portion of her head to reach for the bear, so that is where it drove its teeth. The bear's canines pierced and fractured her skull, popping her bones and sending fragments of her bones into her brain. As the bear was trying to kill her, Amber defiantly stretched her left arm toward the bear with her bear spray in her hand. She pressed the button on the canister from point-blank range and doused the bear's nose, eyes, and mouth. The irritant also covered the area around Amber and affected her negatively as well. The bear was clearly deterred from continuing its attack on Amber at that point, and disappeared into the brush as quickly as it had appeared. She laid on the ground, trying to gather her senses for a moment. She wanted to make sure the bear had actually left and wouldn't return, so she remained still for a few moments afterward. Amber was carrying a special piece of safety equipment that we've discussed previously on this channel. She used her InReach by Garmin to request help immediately as she rinsed the bear spray from her eyes with her water bottle. She sipped some water and waited for the effects of the spray to wane. Amber slowly gathered her feet beneath her, mustering the courage to stand. As she lifted her head, she searched the brush to make sure the bear had not returned. She knew that bears make nearly no noise, and had not even seen what direction in which the bear had fled. Amber knew that she couldn't stay in bear country while she was injured, and hoped that help would find her before the bear would. She resolved the only situation for her was to try to walk the 2 miles back to her vehicle. As she briskly walked, she tried to assess the extent of her injuries. Her left ear was ringing, and her head hurt badly. Her hat slipped from her head while she was walking, and when she replaced it, she felt the back of her skull. The skin around the grizzly's bite was swollen and misplaced. She knew she had no time to examine it right now, so she bravely pressed on toward her vehicle. While she walked, Amber distracted herself by thinking of artifacts she might find on her hike out. She hoped she might find a nice moose antler shed the prior winter. She did everything she could to make as much noise as she walked to ensure any moose or bears in her area knew she was there. Amber briskly walked for the better part of an hour through snowfields and muddy points in the trail before she finally reached the safety of her truck. She was so comfortable that she had the forethought to stow her backpack before getting some water and pulling a snack from her backpack. Amber knew she needed to do something to slow the bleeding from the grizzly's bite on her head, so she took her sweater and wrapped it around her head. She avoided looking into the mirror so that she wasn't alarmed by the sight and seriousness of her wounds. After getting herself comfortable, Amber turned the key on her truck and began searching for anyone she could find. About 3 miles down the road, the rear license plate of a vehicle invigorated her. Amber honked the horn on her truck and waved her hand out of the window, trying to get the attention of the driver of the vehicle. Eventually, the driver pulled over, and Amber left her truck to chat with the man. She asked him if he could help her get to the hospital, and explained that she had her skull crushed by a grizzly bear. The man quickly agreed to help her and assisted her into his truck. Amber and her rescuer had scantly drove a mile down the road before they saw an ambulance pull into view. They'd been dispatched to answer her request for help sent earlier by her InReach device. The first responders quickly loaded her into the ambulance and began to administer medical care as they sped toward Highway 2. As soon as they reached the highway, Amber was loaded into a medical helicopter and was flown to Kalispell Regional Medical Center in Kalispell, Montana. Once she arrived at the medical center, she was informed that her recovery would take at least 3 months. Her follow-up treatment would take a year. After significant assessment, the grizzly's bite on her skull was not found to have severed any nerves, but did damage muscles in her neck and arm. Amber was found to have lost 95% of the hearing in her left ear. Undaunted as she was, Amber was told the doctor overseeing her treatment would not allow her to return to work immediately, so she was hired back to her former position with the Idaho Fish and Game while she healed. DNA analysis had to be completed to determine if it was a black bear or a grizzly bear that had attacked her. The attack had occurred so quickly that even Amber wasn't sure which species had been the culprit. Following her attack, she says she has even more respect for bears than she had before it. She maintains that this experience will make her a better bear manager and broaden her knowledge and experience from which to draw. After DNA evidence from her attack scene was analyzed, the bear that attacked Amber was found to be a 24-year-old male bear that had been captured previously in 2005. This bear had spent his entire life in the Cabinet Yaak Mountains, which Amber found fascinating. Amber stated that through her experience she had learned a lot about herself. She found it reassuring that she had defended herself and even assisted in her own rescue following her devastating attack. She indicates that she has no regrets following her bear attack. She states that she and the bear spooked each other and doesn't fault the bear for doing what it did to defend itself. Amber's grizzly bear attack was determined to be a defensive attack and no action was taken against the bear. It had no record of being a threat or nuisance to humans and was allowed to continue its life unabated. Amber says the bear spray absolutely saved her life. Due to her training on how to properly dispense it, its use was effective and was the determining factor in her survival. Well, I'm sure that you agree with me in my saying that Amber is the most beautiful and toughest bear researcher in the world. After reviewing the details of this attack, I have a few questions for you. Do you think it ironic that a bear researcher was attacked by a bear? Why do you think Amber wasn't issued a firearm for her protection? What could Amber have done to avoid this attack? Would you return to the field to research grizzly bears after having your skull crushed by one? I know I wouldn't. She's tougher than me. I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Canadian North, near Whitehorse, Yukon Territory. The geography here is mountains with thick forests of quaking aspen and larch. Grasses and berry bushes cover the ground in an emerald blanket. Common animals in this area include muskox, elk, caribou, sheep, and moose in the valleys, and mountain goats on the high peaks. Predators in this area include wolves, wolverines, cougar, black bears, and enormous grizzly bears. Field Johnson was a native big game guide in the territory just west of Whitehorse. He'd spent many years guiding hunters in harvesting game animals around his home and knew every nook and cranny where they could be found. He lived among the oxbows along Cracker Creek with its lush foliage and gentle slopes. In the spring of 1950, he knew he needed to replenish his stores of meat. The winter had cut his stores down as he managed through another harsh season. His preferred firearm was his trusty .30-30 rifle. It had helped him harvest animals that provided food for him as well as protected him from any threat that arose. Field decided he would go hunting for moose in the hills just above his home in Champaign, Yukon Territory, Canada. After rounding up his needed supplies, it wasn't long before Field had arrived at the promising moose hunting territory he most preferred. He'd left early in the morning, and since the long bright days of summer were still to come, the darkness of winter still cloaked the land from his vision. This wasn't anything new to Field, given he lived so far north. The winter time brings steady darkness for almost 5 months of the year. As the seasons change, this darkness gives way stubbornly to longer days, eventually leading to nearly full daylight for most hours of the days of summer. Navigating through the dark woods was just part of everyday life for people like Field, and was dealt with just as another hardship in an already hardscrabble existence. As he slipped through the brush and branches that were so promising for his desired moose meat, he scanned the shadows, hoping for a huge dark form to appear before him. As he turned his head in one direction, he felt himself thrown through the air, after a silent explosion of force had slammed into him. He tumbled several yards down the slope and lay still, unsure of what exactly had just happened to him. It was but a few seconds before the source of this blow emerged from up the hill. He immediately knew it was a huge grizzly, so common in the area, and froze, hoping that the bear would leave him. Years of experience with grizzlies told him that if he moved, showed signs of life, or tried to fight back, it may only invite a more violent impartation of force from the bear. After approaching Field, the bear swatted at him and clawed him. It watched him for any signs of life, and he knew if he didn't move, he may be able to convince it he was dead. After clawing the man up severely, it scraped up sticks, leaves, and mud from all around him as the hunter lay flat on his stomach. He fought the urge to look directly at the bear and focused on playing dead. With any luck, he could convince the bear that its powerful initial blow had killed him, and he worked hard to lay still and silent. After the bear had spent the better part of an hour scraping duff over Field's body, it padded around him, sniffing and watching him. Soon it disappeared, and he could only hope it had left for good. He knew that the bear had buried him in hopes of coming back and consuming him later. The question was, what time would it return? Field could feel his blood oozing from wounds all over his body, and felt the pain of each of his wounds as his adrenaline began to fade. He hadn't heard the bear in some time, and thought it may be a good time to try to escape before the bear returned. He slowly pulled himself from beneath the foliage and debris. Field stumbled as he regained his bearings and searched for a direction to flee. What Field didn't know was that the giant grizzly had buried him, then laid down over its latest meal claim to rest. As soon as he stood to his feet, the grizzly roared from the nearby bushes and attacked him once again. The grizzly cuffed him with each of its paws back and forth several times. Each swat from the bear's paws tore clothing, skin, and muscle tissue with ease. The bear bit huge holes in his legs and arms and used its claws to shear gashes into his flesh. As the bear continued to tear Field limb from limb, consciousness faded and his body went limp. With Field unconscious, the bear undoubtedly thought he was finally dead. It bit onto his lower leg and dragged him for about a mile, with his lifeless body bouncing over rocks and through stabbing brush. After it was convinced that it had moved Field to a more preferred location, it again began to scrape duff, mud, and sticks over his body to bury him in a second food cache. By late afternoon, Field had regained consciousness once again. The wounds in his body had drained him of vital fluids, and his thirst was immense. His body was battered and torn brutally, and every part of him ached from the violence the grizzly had imparted on him. Field knew that he would not survive a night in the frigid forest after being brutalized in such a violent way. He would have to gamble on pulling himself from the duff the bear had buried him beneath once again. If the bear returned to him this time, it would certainly be the death of him. Field carefully and cautiously crawled from the mound and tottered to his feet. He was too exhausted to look around and confirm the bear wasn't closing in on him for a final attack. The man knew that all he could do was stumble in the direction of the busiest place near him, the Alaska Highway. By this point, Field was covered with sticks, mud, and coagulated blood from head to toe. He stumbled his way through several miles of forest and finally climbed the shoulder of the highway he hoped would be his point of eventual rescue. As he rested on the side of the highway, a vehicle appeared in the distance. As it neared him, Field waved frantically, and the driver pulled over. Finding a man in such condition in the middle of nowhere might be enough of a fright to send most people down the road after stomping on the accelerator, but this man helped Field into his vehicle. The driver immediately pointed his vehicle toward the town of Whitehorse and the hospital that would provide medical help to the injured man. While at the hospital, Field learned that the bear attack had done a great deal of damage to his body, even more than the pain had indicated. An assessment of his injuries revealed that both of his arms and several ribs were broken by the bear. His scalp was completely misplaced and hung to his head by a thin piece of skin. While dragging him, the bear had chewed up his feet severely, and huge gashes in his thighs were torn by its claws. Field spent 2 months in the hospital before being released. Upon his release, Field immediately returned to the site of his attack in search of his rifle. Incredibly, he managed to find it. Field didn't waste any time returning home, but immediately set out to find the bear who had so violently hunted and attacked him. He knew that the bear would not stop hunting and killing people, and that this bad bear had to die to prevent anyone else from suffering a similar fate. He returned to the area surrounding his grizzly bear attack, but no record could be found indicating that he was successful in avenging himself. Within a year, Field had wasted away in comparison to his form prior to the attack. His health had failed him, as his injuries were too taxing on his condition. I'm sure the mental trauma of experiencing such a violent and painful attack contributed to his demise. In his recounting of the attack, Field never indicated that he had seen cubs, nor had he smelled or seen a food cache. It can safely be assumed that this bear attack was a predatory bear attack, given the nature and severity of Field's injuries. There is no record of what happened to the bear after its attack on Field. It is assumed that it was not killed by anyone, and died of natural causes at the end of its life cycle. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think it was too great a risk for Field to enter the forest while it was dark? Why do you think the bear left Field after burying him the second time? Was this attack a predatory or defensive attack? Would you have returned to the same place to get revenge on a grizzly bear that surprised you in a violent attack? I will be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comment section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to a residential backyard for not one, but two different bear attacks, a few years apart. In Muncie Creek Township, Pennsylvania, black bears are becoming too common in human areas. The township is low in elevation at around 400 feet high in the valley and largely developed into an urban area ringed by acreages. It lies in Lycoming County, which is dotted with small townships and wild woodlands. The hills surrounding the area are covered by dense and protective forests, nearly devoid of roads or trails. They are almost impenetrable with tangles of underbrush so thick that visibility is under a few yards in most places. The stands of berry bushes here are diverse and very common. Delicious and nutritious sources of sugar and vitamins, such as blueberries, blackberries, boysenberries, and raspberries, are some of the most plentiful, just to name a few. The larger animals here include white-tailed deer and elk, with smaller animals consisting of raccoons, possums, hares, and cottontail rabbits. The predators here are scaled to the size of their prey. Smaller predators include shrews, weasels, foxes, bobcats, and coyotes, with the largest predator being the very common black bears of the area. On the evening time of December 12, 2018, Melinda LeBaron was enjoying her rented residence on Peach Orchard Road. She and her husband Sid had rented the home from landlord, neighbor, and friend Corinne Levan. Melinda was approaching 50 years old and enjoyed the home's rural location while still being near the amenities that Muncie Creek had to offer residents. She is a very petite woman weighing only 107 pounds and is spunky well beyond her tiny size. Her constant companion was her 2-year-old Pekingese Chihuahua mixed dog, ironically named Bear. As Melinda felt the urge to take a smoke break from the evening chore duties, she called to Bear and headed toward the back door of her home. Her backyard butted up to a large wood line and didn't have a fence. After opening the door, Bear streaked past her. Bear began growling and barking at something just around the corner of the house, and Melinda slowly walked over to investigate what was causing all of the commotion. Before she got to the corner of the home, her vision was filled with an enormous, angry black bear closing in on her faster than reaction would allow. Now, it wouldn't take a lot of force to knock Melinda off her feet, but that doesn't mean the bear held back. One of the few things Melinda remembers being able to visually process in the lightning-fast bear attack was seeing the bear's claws as it closed in on her. Melinda's only thought was that she was finished as she stared up at the bear from her back. The bear had taken her down by tripping her with its paws and was now standing over the top of her. It clamped its jaws on her head and raked parts of her scalp away from her skull. Melinda was in shock nearly instantly and didn't report hearing any flesh tearing or bones breaking, but was powerless to escape the speed and aggression of the bear. As Melinda did her best to protect herself, the bear bit and clawed her head, hip, and back as it viciously attacked her. As she rolled and yelled, it bit and clawed her toward the edge of the woods in front of her house. At several points in the attack, Melinda yelled at the bear to stop it as the pain of each bite seared through her body, but the black bear would not relent. Each time she rolled to her stomach, the bear would swat and bite her, forcing her to roll further from her house. It alternately bit onto Melinda's hip and shoulder to carry her a short distance until the pair was just off the shoulder of the road, across from Melinda's house. It continued to maul Melinda, peeling her pants and undergarments from her body during the attack. Suddenly the bear stopped attacking Melinda and sat down beside her. Melinda was terrified as she thought of what was next to come. She figured the bear would either continue to carry her into the woods farther or eat her where she lay. She tried to remain as still as possible, hoping the bear would lose interest. Over the course of several minutes, the bear sat there beside Melinda, panting and staring at her as she lay still. After a short time, she reached over and grabbed a nearby stick. She threw the stick a short distance into the nearby bushes, hoping to change the bear's focus. After watching the stick hit the bushes, the bear stood to her feet and slowly wandered off back into the forest. Melinda remained still until she was convinced the bear had actually left. She peered around with her face toward the ground, searching for the bear in her peripheral vision. Once she was certain the bear was no longer near her, Melinda began to assess her injuries briefly. She could feel her ear dangling from the skin and a large piece of her scalp completely missing. The pain in her shoulder and hip was excruciating, as each location had several puncture wounds from the bear's teeth made when it carried her 90 yards from her backyard. She was completely discombobulated and crawled backward to a small tree. 2 of its branches were within her reach, so she used them to pull herself up off the ground. She glanced around trying to get her bearings. Across the street she could see the glow of her front porch light and began crawling back toward her home. When she realized she was too injured to continue, she called out to her neighbor Corrine. She came running to Melinda's side and helped her into her home. First responders arrived immediately and transported Melinda to Geisinger Medical Institute in Danville. She spent 2 weeks in the trauma unit in critical condition with major injuries to her head, hip, and shoulder. The bear had torn a significant portion of her scalp, as well as bit her hip and shoulder several times, causing major tissue damage. She received skin grafts on her forehead, and a medical drain was placed just under her skin. Melinda underwent 9 more operations in the few weeks following her attack. Her dog Bear suffered a broken rib, a punctured lung, and a gash on his stomach, but fully recovered shortly after the attack. After 2 months of medical attention, Melinda was released to finish her healing at her home. As her ride pulled up to her home, she could see a huge "Welcome Home" sign stretched across the front of her house. After her attack, a search for the bear yielded 2 cubs, but no sow bear. The authorities abandoned the search, assuming the bear had fled the area. But that isn't the end of the story. On the evening of Saturday, October 17, 2020, Melinda once again went to her backyard with Bear for a potty break. Suddenly, a black blur shot out of the bushes and headed toward Bear. Melinda was terrified. The most traumatizing event of her life was occurring once again. As soon as Bear saw the black bear running toward him, he turned tail and headed straight for Melinda. I am sure he was hoping she would protect him, but Bear would not make it to the safety of his owner's arms. Just as Bear reached the porch steps, the black bear pinned him to the ground with its immense paws. Sid quickly snapped loose a curtain rod that was above the porch. He used it to poke and prod the bear away from his wife and himself. After he realized that the bear wasn't going to release Bear, the past trauma forced them to seek their own safety first. They managed to rush inside the back door and slam it shut, leaving Bear to face the bear's wrath alone. Bear did not survive this attack. The black bear took his life in the violent and ruthless attack on the little dog. Melinda and Sid believe it was the same bear that killed their dog and attacked Melinda a few years prior. They believe something is wrong with this bear and that it seems to have a vendetta for them, or at least it had one against their dog Bear. The Pennsylvania Game Commission contends that it was likely a different black bear in each attack on the LeBarons. They cite the fact that there were no cubs present when Bear was attacked, as there were in Melinda's attack. They admit there is just no way to know for sure. Given that sow black bears do not have cubs every year, the fact that there were no cubs present does not necessarily preclude the possibility of both attacks being conducted by the same bear. The Game Commission did place a culvert trap in a field near the LeBarons' home. They also notified residents in the area to remove their bird feeders and put away their trash cans to keep bears from roaming into the neighborhood. There was no record of the trap catching any bears. According to records that date back to colonial times, there has never been a fatal black bear attack on any human beings in Pennsylvania, but Melinda's was very close to being the first. If it had happened even a few decades before, the outcome may have been very different. In the state of Pennsylvania, officials estimate that there are around 20,000 black bears spread across 46,055 square miles. This puts bear concentrations at about 1 black bear per 2 square miles. That is a very high density and maybe the highest density of black bears in the United States. According to authorities, there have been 30 black bear attacks in the state in the last 30 years. After reviewing the facts surrounding these attacks, I have a few questions for you. Do you think both attacks were done by the same black bear? What more could Melinda have done to avoid either of these attacks? Why do you think Bear was such a prime target for black bears near the LeBarons' home? Do you believe the black bear would have tried to attack Melinda if Sid hadn't been home during the second attack? I will be glad to read and answer your thoughts, so post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us back to mountainous western Montana and the beautiful scenery of Glacier National Park. The mountains here are huge and stretch their rocky peaks into the sky. The forests on them are packed with pine, fir, spruce, and aspen trees with willow and green, as well as red alder densely crowding the bodies of water in the valleys. Here, white-tailed deer, moose, and elk disappear and reappear like ghosts while they search for their fodder. The large predators of this area include wolves, cougars, as well as black and grizzly bears. At 9 a.m. on Monday, August 14th of the year 2000, 26-year-old Kelly Krapata and his 27-year-old girlfriend Kim Taffer were just 4 miles short of finishing their 55-mile hiking vacation. Kelly was walking slightly ahead of Kim as they chatted during the hike. Kelly was originally from Carmel, California, but relocated to Ann Arbor, Michigan to attend business school. That is where he met Kim. She was in the business program at Ann Arbor as well, and the two of them had a mutual appreciation for the outdoors. The two hikers were working on developing a budding romance and enjoyed each other's company on the hiking trip. They had put a lot of time into planning their trip to Glacier and decided to spend some time trail camping their way through some of the most beautiful parts. Before departing for their hike, they had watched a video on what to do if you encounter a bear in the backcountry at the park office. They had camped at Granite Park Campground on Sunday and were now making their way down Swift Current Pass Trail. This trail goes through the Many Glaciers area on the east side of the park. As they navigated the trail, they whistled and talked loudly with each other. They also wore bear bells and packed bear spray on their trip. As the two hikers hiked around Bullhead Lake, they rounded a bend in the trail. As the trail came into view, the hikers were terrified by the reality that a bear was sprinting toward them from only 50 yards away. They knew the bear would either stop or be on them before they would have time to react. They could see the bear reaching out with its front paws in leaps that covered 10 feet each. Kelly knew he would not be able to pull out his bear spray and decided that curling up in the fetal position and pretending to be dead was the best option. As Kelly hit the ground, Kim took a couple of steps into the bushes along the trail and curled into a ball herself, hoping the bushes may provide some kind of concealment. The angry bear immediately bore down on Kelly. His bear spray was clipped to the shoulder strap on his backpack, but the attack came on so quickly that he couldn't even get it out of the holster. The futility of the forethought of buying it for just this instance seemed bitterly ironic as he felt the bear swiping at his back and legs. With Kelly's head protected by his arms, the bear sank its canine teeth into the flesh of his thighs. It bit and clawed anything within reach as Kelly was jerked and pulled back and forth from the force of the bear's attack. The bear continued to claw his legs and hips while it drove its teeth into the same areas. For about 10 seconds, the bear tore and bit at Kelly while he screamed, but remained face down. Kim could see out of the corner of her eye and ominously saw the bear leave Kelly and walk over toward her. She could see a big brown blur just a few inches from her head. She refused to move or even make a sound. The bear spent a few seconds looking her over, then it turned around and walked away from the hikers. As soon as she was certain the bear had left the area, Kim scurried over to Kelly's side. His backpack was completely torn up and his sleeping roll was in tatters. He was still prone and still, too worried to move in case the bear was watching nearby. Kelly and Kim tried to walk the remaining distance to finish the hike, but Kelly's injuries were too devastating. They decided to sit down and wait for someone to come along and find help for them. As they waited, they called out for help and kept a watchful eye out for the bear to return. After around 30 minutes, a park ranger overheard their shouts for help. He was just patrolling the trail area and happened to be in the perfect spot to help the hikers. The ranger administered first aid to stop the biggest sources of bleeding. He worked hard to comfort the hikers and calm them down. They were shaking and upset. He was worried about shock setting in on Kelly. Kelly's injuries were not life-threatening, so the rescuers decided not to use a helicopter to evacuate him. They initially tried to position him on a horse to ride back to the trailhead. The injuries to his hips and legs were too painful and debilitating for this to be completed, so they arranged for a litter to be brought to them. An ambulance was waiting for Kelly at the trailhead after the wheeled litter moved him 3.5 miles down the trail. Kelly was quickly loaded into the ambulance and drove to Browning Hospital in Great Falls at about 3 p.m. on the same day. In the hospital, Kelly had several puncture wounds to his hips and legs sutured up. Several lacerations from the bear's claws were also closed, using stitches. While investigating the bear attack, bear scat was found at the scene. Investigators took samples of the scat to analyze for the presence of DNA. This might tell the investigators if they are looking for a black bear or a grizzly. It may also yield information indicating which individual bear was involved if they could connect it to a sample from a specific individual bear. Kelly had been planning to run in the Chicago Marathon in October but had to cancel the plans. He did indicate that this attack would not keep him from hiking, but he did say he would just not hike in bear country anymore. Officials indicated that the hikers' actions most likely minimized their injuries during the attack. Kim's quick thinking kept her from being injured at all. The western edge of Montana has had 11 human fatalities to bear attacks in the last 50 years. Montana has over 2,100 grizzly bears and around 15,000 black bears. Given that most of the state is farmland in the east, that puts nearly all of these bears in the western portion of the state. When Lewis and Clark came through this portion of Montana, they estimated that there were 50,000 grizzlies here, but numbers dwindled to under 1,000 at one point when they were endangered. After reviewing the details of this attack, I have a few questions for you. Do you think that bear bells do any good? Do you think the hikers let their guard down, being only 4 miles from the end of their long hiking trip? Why did the bear attack Kelly but not touch Kim? Do you think clipping your bear spray to your belt is better than clipping it to your backpack straps? Do you think Kelly got off relatively easy because he played dead? I will gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to the lush and beautiful temperate rainforests of western coastal Canada. Oh, we are not going to the backcountry forests or trails to discuss a chance incident that led to a regrettable outcome. In fact, we don't really have to leave the town of Port Renfrew on Vancouver Island for this episode. The marina at Port Renfrew is crowded with skiffs and pontoons, and even a few small sailboats. The sailors here vary in their pursuits, which can include activities ranging from recreational sailing to sport fishing. The fish that are pursued in this area are any of the 7 subspecies of salmon. Not only is the fish a favorite of humans, but the local bears like them as well. Just after 5 p.m. on Tuesday, September 9th, 2008, a 52-year-old fisherman, whom we will call Sam, and his fishing partner, whom we will call Dan, were reporting their catch of coho salmon at the office of the marina. After reporting their catch, they gutted the fish by cutting open the abdomen of the salmon they had caught that day and using the seawater in the marina to wash out the blood and guts from the flesh of the fish. Gutting the fish has to be completed within a few hours of catching them, or they stand a good chance of going rotten before you can eat them. As the men walked toward Sam's boat, they watched as a strange sight occurred. They could see across the marina a black bear's head bobbing through the small waves in the water. It seemed to be coming in their direction, but black bears are a very common animal here, and bears are known for doing some pretty random things at times, so the men simply kept their eyes on the bear. The bear must have slipped their minds as they boarded their boat that was tied off to the dock at the marina. The bear had pulled itself onto the wharf and was now tailing the men down the dock from only 50 yards away. Sam was from Salt Spring Island, which is located on the east side of Vancouver Island. The human population there is very low, and many people rely on fishing for their subsistence. Seeing a black bear in the area isn't anything frightening or new to them, as they are so common. Sam suspected that the bear had come to steal their salmon. Perhaps it had seen the fish from the other side of the marina and jumped in the water to get them from the men, or perhaps it had smelled them and decided to investigate. Either way, the black bear was now standing on the boat and was acting very aggressively toward the men. Sam decided that the fish were not worth fighting for, and in full view of the bear, threw the salmon into the water next to his boat. He expected to see the black bear dive back into the water to fetch the fish and then be on his merry way, but the bear wasn't interested in the salmon, and Sam watched as his prized catch disappeared beneath the dark waters of the marina with no reaction from the bear. Sam was now very concerned that this bear's intent wasn't what was expected. Normally, a bear would do anything to get a full salmon, and anyone would think that 2 or 3 of them would be that much more enticing. But the bear kept its focus on Sam, while Dan looked on from the dock. It crept slowly across the boat with its eyes focused on Sam. Now, this wasn't the first time Port Renfrew Marina had had incidents with bears showing up and misbehaving. In fact, black bears had been reported walking down the piers from time to time. They had been seen going down the ramps and even boarding boats in the marina occasionally to look for food. The marina staff never really did much about it, because at the end of each foray into the marina, the bears would inevitably leave without any serious incident. But after today's events, a different protocol would definitely have to be adopted. The black bear slowly approached Sam before suddenly pouncing on him. It knocked him to the deck of the boat and began biting at his arm first. Sam held it out to keep the bear's teeth away from his head, which was clearly the bear's focus. After the bear chomped several dime-sized holes through Sam's arm, it worked its way up to his shoulder. It was slashing at Sam with its claws while it worked its jaws in the direction of his head. As it neared his shoulder, it clamped its jaws nearly all the way around his shoulder joint and drove its teeth deep into his muscle and bone. It was clearly intent on killing him, as it was not trying to run him off with jaw pops and chuffing. Dan yelled and kicked the bear as it stood over Sam, but the bear paid him absolutely no mind. It was focused completely on killing Sam, and nothing would draw its attention from this. Dan eventually realized this situation would require more than his yells and kicks. He began to holler toward the other fishermen around the marina. At first, they simply looked over in his direction, unsure of what was going on, but as his words began to relay what was happening, one by one, several responders began to show up and board Sam's boat to help out. Bruce Miller was among the handful of fishermen who raced to respond to Dan's cries for help. Bruce was 40 years old at the time of this attack, and for the past 6 years he was the owner-operator of his own charter called Miller Time Charters. He carried his gaff hook he used to pull large halibut aboard his boat as he hurried toward the bear attack. The gaff had a large barbless hook on the end used to snag the fish, and the hook was fixed to a long pole. Bruce used the pole's length to slam the bear with the large metal hook several times, but the bear paid no mind. Bruce estimated that he hooked the bear with his halibut gaff about 10 times, but to no avail. Its sole focus was on killing Sam, and it would not be distracted. Bruce and Dan looked on, unsure of what to do next, when another fisherman ran up with a hammer and began pummeling the bear. The stubborn bear didn't react and refused to release its grip on Sam. At this point, several men were punching, kicking, and striking the bear with any implement they could get their hands on, but the bear continued its attack on Sam. Now, there is one particularly dangerous piece of equipment that nearly all fishermen carry with them. They aren't known for toting bear spray in their boats because the likelihood of seeing a bear on your boat is virtually non-existent. They didn't have firearms because what good would a firearm do if you weren't hunting from your boat? If you were fishing, it would just be added weight, and you may even shoot a hole in your hull if you accidentally discharged it. But every fisherman carries a filleting knife for cutting the fish fillets away from their bony carcass. These knives are typically thin metal blades that are extremely sharp and come to a very fine point. While a few of the men held the bear down, one of the fishermen plunged his filleting knife into the bear's throat. The bear didn't acknowledge the knife wound, so the fisherman began sawing at the bear's throat. The initial knife wound was likely intended to get the bear to stop attacking Sam, but when the bear didn't react as desired, the knife became a tool to end its attack once and for all. As the fisherman sawed at the bear's throat, piercing the thick hide and fur, he severed the major blood vessels that provide blood to the bear's brain. Its blood poured onto the deck of the boat, but the bear continued its focused attack on Sam. Within a few minutes, the devastating wound from the filleting knife began to take its toll on the bear. It continued to attack Sam, but with less energy and violence. It wasn't very long before the bear collapsed on the deck of the boat, dead from the wounds the knife inflicted. Sam was immediately flown by air ambulance to Victoria General Hospital, where he remained conscious and in stable condition after the attack. He was later taken to Royal Jubilee Hospital, where surgery was completed to repair some damaged tissues in his shoulder and arms. After being killed by the fisherman, the bear's corpse remained on Sam's boat until it was recovered by conservation officers. A necropsy was performed on the bear, and it was reportedly a 10-year-old male, weighing about 170 pounds. It was reportedly in poor health and was clearly underweight. Bruce didn't miss a day of fishing and was out on his boat the very next day. His wife said she wasn't surprised and described him as something else. When commenting about the attack, Bruce said it was clear the bear wanted to eat Sam. He stated it was very clear that nothing would stop this bear from getting what he wanted. Mike Hicks, who owned a fishing resort near Port Renfrew, stated that he wasn't surprised to hear of the bear attack. He was the citizen who called in to report the bears in the marina 3 weeks before Sam's attack. He was horrified to see people taking pictures at the time and shooing the bears away as if they were harmless nuisances. He stated that the disregard for the danger the bears bring was bizarre to see. When Hicks called conservation officers to request that the bears be killed or relocated, his pleas were rebuffed with the explanation that nothing could be done unless someone was in imminent danger. Hicks was disgusted after hearing of Sam's attack and how it could have been prevented. Conservation Officer Gord Hitchcock stated that the fishermen needed to take responsibility for leaving trash and fish scraps around which lure the bears into the area. He continued that, if it doesn't happen, then they will just be killing bear after bear. Since 1986, 8 people have been killed by black bears and 75 have been injured in British Columbia. The province is estimated to have between 120,000 to 150,000 black bears, which is among the highest populations in the world. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think the authorities were negligent in not removing the bears or hazing them away from the marina? Why didn't the bear go after Sam's salmon when he threw them overboard? What made this bear focus so intently on killing Sam? Do you think the bear was in poor shape due to starvation from the overpopulation of black bears in the area? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so post them in the comment section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to just another one of the states in our All 50 U.S. States Bear Attacks tour. In the state of Maryland, you might think of turtles or crabs as the most dangerous wildlife in the state, but after today's episode, you may reconsider. In northern Maryland, Gambrel State Park is a natural respite from the modernity surrounding it. The park is set on the first range of mountains rising from the lowlands that make up the eastern part of the state. It is a hub of social events for the nearby town of Frederick and features cabin rentals and tent camping sites and is crisscrossed by nature trails. Wildlife in this area includes white-tailed deer, eagles, and turkeys. Little animals like turtles, snakes, and raccoons are common. The animal that very few people count on seeing is one of the several black bears that roam the area around the park. On September 21, 2020, 55-year-old Renee Laveau was enjoying a walk in the park with her 2 dogs. Kylie and Bones were German Shepherds and enjoyed walks with Renee nearly every day. Renee worked as a home care provider for her profession, and it afforded her a comfortable life in a setting that brought her peace and comfort. They had been coming to the park together for several years without ever encountering any bears. They didn't pack bear spray, nor did they bring a firearm on any of their walks. The area around Renee's home is surrounded by a thick expanse of forest, about 3 miles wide by about 10 miles long. It doesn't have a lot of roads through it, and there are very few people in the area other than day hikers and campers. It is kind of this little pocket of wilderness in the middle of an otherwise modern and busy area. After a few miles of walking and enjoying the trees and scenery, Renee, Kylie, and Bones were only about a half mile from Renee's home. Suddenly, Kylie's ears perked up and her head pointed at something in the bushes only about 30 yards away. Kylie dashed off to investigate while Renee looked on curiously. She probably thought it may be a raccoon or a deer, as they are both common sights in the park, but what emerged from the bushes was much more dangerous than either of these. Right when Renee saw the bear, the only thing that ran through her head was that she was screwed. She couldn't run because the bear was so close it would run her down in no time. She knew that whatever she did in the next few moments would be pivotal to her health and possibly her survival. Now Renee was no small lady. She stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, and the bear that emerged didn't look very big. Kylie ran right up to the bear and nipped it a few times on the nose, and the bear took exception to the bites and swatted out of frustration at the dog twice with its paws. Renee thought back for a moment about how to handle a confrontation with a bear. She recalled how you should make yourself look big and yell to frighten the bear off. That is what the experts recommend after all. She raised her hands above her head and waved them around while yelling at the bear. Upon seeing her movement, the bear dropped its head and quickly dashed directly toward Renee. As the bear climbed the slight hill Renee was standing on, Kylie pursued the bear and bit it on the rear. The bear paid no mind to the bites, as it clearly had its eyes set on attacking Renee. As the bear closed to within a few yards of Renee, it stood to its hind legs and reached its paws toward her. She could see every detail. Each claw of its paws and its teeth stood out to her as she studied the bear in fractions of a second as it walked toward her. The bear was about the same height as Renee and didn't seem to be a lot bigger than she was, but any bear is several times stronger than a human being. The bear growled as it closed in on Renee. It now was so close she could have reached out and touched its nose with her hands. As Renee and the bear momentarily looked at each other, the bear made up its mind. It swatted Renee in the chest very quickly and opened up a 6-inch gash on her upper breast. As she stumbled back a few steps, the bear pushed her to the ground and bit her left leg twice just behind her knee. The bear swatted Renee back in the other direction so quickly that she didn't even see the bear's paw coming at her. Before she could react to the second swat, she felt the bear clamp its jaws onto the left side of her face. Renee heard the bones around her left eye socket cracking under the bite pressure of the bear, and she wondered what to do next. When some people face death, they say their life flashes before their eyes, but not Renee. The attack happened so quickly that she didn't have time to think, reflect, or even react. Immediately after hearing her facial bones cracking on the left side of her face, Renee felt the bear bite down on the right side of her face in about the same area. She was filled with terror as she just wanted to get away and not feel the pain of another bite from the bear. Hearing the bones of her skull crunching under the force of the bear's jaws was horrifying to her, as she had no way to defend herself from the power and speed of the bear. The only thing Renee could do was to put her hands on the bear's neck and try to keep its head from being close enough for it to bite her skull again. She knew the bear was either going to kill her or she would think of a way to keep it from doing so. Since fighting the bear off was not realistic, Renee rolled onto her stomach and stopped moving altogether. She put her arms up around her head and did her best to lay still, hoping the bear would be distracted by Kylie and Bones, or lose interest in her and leave. Renee could feel her blood gushing down her face and into her hands. She knew she couldn't take much more punishment before she would lose consciousness and possibly die. As Renee lay on the ground, she could hear the bear sniffing her right ear. It rumbled a low growl right into her ear as it inspected her for signs of life. She remained still and refused to twitch as she knew it might rekindle the bear's attack. Suddenly, everything went silent. No dogs barking, no bear breathing or growling. Renee knew if she lifted her head to investigate, the bear might see her movement and renew its attack. She lay there as still as possible for about 10 minutes, before slowly reaching her hand along her side while searching for her phone. Renee dug around in her pocket and pulled out her cell phone. Dialing 911, she relayed the location and injuries she had suffered to the dispatcher. It was only a few more minutes before first responders arrived on the scene to help her. Fortunately for Renee, one of her neighbors was the chief of the local fire department and was very quick to arrive at her location. By the time he got there, Renee had rolled over onto her back and sat up. Although she wasn't sure how much damage the bear had done to her face, she was relieved to see someone had come to help. The fire chief asked Renee a few questions as he looked her over. An ambulance was requested to Renee's location and arrived after only a few minutes. They loaded Renee up into the back and quickly drove her to Meritus Hospital in Hagerstown, about 30 minutes away. The medical team performed various examinations to gauge just how much damage the bear had done to Renee's face and head. After the initial medical assessment, the medical team decided to transfer Renee to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore by helicopter. This hospital features one of the best trauma units in the nation, and they sutured Renee's face and scalp together over the course of a 4-hour surgery. The suturing was extremely painful, as Renee recounted, but she endured it. The medical team administered a local anesthetic to numb her flesh as the plastic surgeon sutured her wounds, but she could still feel the stitching as they went. Renee's wounds included the 6-inch gash opened up on her chest by the bear's initial swat, deep bite wounds on her left leg, torn tissues around her left ear and scalp, as well as lacerations on her left cheek and face. The bear's jaw broke her orbital bones around her left eye during the attack as well. On the right side of her face, she had bite marks near her scalp, and the nerves near her eyebrow were severed. The pictures of Renee's attack would not be allowed according to YouTube standards, so I have posted several of them on my Patreon account, linked below. They are pretty gruesome, so if you are squeamish, don't look at them. Renee was released from Johns Hopkins Hospital almost 2 days after being admitted and was walking within a few more days. She was bruised from head to toe but was grateful to escape with the injuries she had, as the attack could have ended much worse. Renee stated that it took nearly 2 years for most of the sensation on her face and scalp to return. She says it feels strange when she touches the areas that are still numb. Renee now carries bear spray and wears bear bells whenever she takes Kylie and Bones out for walks. She makes a point to recommend to people she sees walking in the park to pack their bear spray, and even recounts her attack to them to drive the point home when needed. She also tells them to play music or be loud so that they don't surprise any bears that may be in the area. Renee indicates that she still suffers from anxiety and visits a post-traumatic stress therapist to help her overcome her fears. Even though she is still filled with fear, she still walks her dogs on the same route as where the attack occurred. A brief investigation into the circumstances surrounding Renee's attack was conducted by local officials. They could not locate the bear and concluded it had left the area after its attack on Renee. They also pointed out that in 2020, a weather anomaly had reduced local acorn availability to bears and brought bears into residential neighborhoods and towns in search of food. Officials had issued warnings to local residents about the situation prior to Renee's attack. In the 10-year span between 2009 and 2019, black bears in Maryland were reported in over 480 nuisance calls from citizens. In the same period, farmers reported $18,400 worth of damage each year due to black bears. The most incredible statistic to me is that over 60 bears each year are struck by vehicles in Maryland. There are only 2,000 bears in Maryland, which is only about 12,000 square miles. This ratio means that there is a black bear for every 6 square miles, which puts black bears only half as common as in the neighboring state of New Jersey. Maryland does have a bear hunting season in its 4 westernmost counties. In 2007, lady bear hunter Cody Jones harvested a massive black bear that weighed 615 pounds, and its skull measured 21 inches 10/16, which is huge for a black bear. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I am left with a few questions for you. Do you think Renee's attack was just a matter of her being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or am I missing something? Why didn't Kylie and Bones defend Renee? Do you think Renee lifting her arms and making noise to frighten the bear instigated the attack? Did you know that something as simple as a bad acorn season could put bear populations under such stress? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.